Something in your kitchen right now, something you probably use today, is doing damage to two of the most hardworking organs in your body. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that produces pain or sends you to the emergency room. In the quiet, accumulated, invisible way that chronic damage always works. Day after day, meal after meal, choice after choice, it builds. And by the time the body finally speaks loudly enough to be heard, the conversation has already been going on for years in a language most people were never taught to read. I want to have that conversation with you today. Not to frighten you, because I genuinely believe that fear without direction serves no one, and that the body you are living in right now is capable of far more resilience than the diseases threatening it tend to suggest. But honest conversation requires honesty about what is happening. And so we are going to be honest together, in a way that I hope feels less like a medical lecture and more like the kind of talk you might have with a physician who has time to sit down, look you in the eye, and say, "Here is what I have seen, here is what the science says, and here is what I believe you deserve to know." My name is Dr. Sandrine, 20 years of clinical practice, most of it dedicated to adults in the second half of their lives. And in those 20 years, one of the patterns I have returned to again and again, across hundreds of patients and thousands of consultations, is the profound disconnect between how seriously people take their kidney health and how seriously the kidneys deserve to be taken. People know about the heart, they know about the lungs, they have a sense, however vague, of what the liver does. But the kidneys? They exist in most people's awareness as a kind of background organ. Present, functional, presumably doing their job, but rarely thought about specifically unless something goes dramatically wrong. That invisibility is not coincidental. It is biological. The kidneys are among the most eloquently silent organs in the human body. They absorb damage across years without producing a symptom you could name. They compensate, adapt, work harder with whatever functional tissue remains, and ask for nothing in return, until the compensation is no longer sufficient, until the remaining function falls below the threshold that daily life requires. And at that point, the conversation that should have happened years earlier is finally happening in a clinical setting with options that are narrower than they would have been. I want to change the timing of that conversation for you. I want to have it now, while the options are wide, while the trajectory is still steerable, while the daily choices you make about food and movement and medication and rest still have the power to change what your kidneys look like in 5 years and 10 years and beyond. To do that, I need to start with the biology. Because understanding why the kidneys become more vulnerable after 60 is not a pessimistic exercise. It is the foundation on which every practical protective choice is built. Think for a moment about a river. A broad, powerful, healthy river running at full capacity. The current is strong, water moves with force, sediment is carried along and deposited downstream. The riverbed stays clean, the banks are clear. The whole system is self-maintaining because the movement itself is protective. Now think about that same river in drought. The water level drops, the current weakens. What was once carried along now settles. Sediment accumulates. The riverbed begins to silt. The banks, once clean, begin to collect debris. The system that was self-maintaining through movement begins to accumulate the very things it was designed to clear away. The river has not stopped being a river, but it is a river under stress. And stress, sustained and unaddressed over time, changes a river permanently. Your kidneys are that river. They depend on a strong, consistent, well-supplied blood flow to do their work. The blood is the current. The filtration is the movement. And after 60, the conditions that maintain that current begin, through the entirely normal processes of aging, to shift. Blood vessels throughout the body, including the intricate microvasculature that threads through each kidney's filtering units, become progressively stiffer. The filtration units themselves, the nephrons, which number in the millions at birth, decline in number across the decades through normal age-related attrition. The tubules, the microscopic channels that perform the finest and most precise filtration work, become less efficient. The whole system continues to function, but it functions with less reserve, less resilience, and a narrower margin for additional insult than it had 20 years earlier. This is not disease, this is aging. And the reason it matters so profoundly is precisely because it means that the things we do to the kidneys after 60, the habits, the foods, the medications, the level of movement or stillness in our days land differently than they did when we were younger. The same daily choices that a 40-year-old kidney absorbed and compensated for without lasting consequence can, in a 65-year-old kidney already operating with reduced reserve, become the accumulated pressure that tips the system from functional to declining. The river that was managing the drought begins to silt in ways that cannot simply be reversed by the next rainfall. There is a number I want to share with you, because it is the number that most changes the way my patients think about kidney health once they hear it. Approximately 40% of adults over 60 meet the clinical criteria for some degree of chronic kidney disease. Not catastrophic end-stage kidney failure. Some degree of chronic kidney disease, meaning measurable, documented progressive reduction in filtration efficiency. 40%. Nearly every other person in a room full of older adults. And of that group, the vast majority have no symptoms they can point to. They feel, by their own account, reasonably well. They are going about their lives, making their daily choices, largely unaware that those choices are occurring inside a body whose kidneys are already under measurable progressive stress. I am not sharing that number to alarm you. I am sharing it because it reframes the conversation about prevention. When we talk about protecting kidney health after 60, we are not talking about a rare or distant risk. We are talking about the most common form of organ decline in older adults, occurring silently in millions of people who have never been told specifically what is driving it or what they have the power to change. So let us talk about what drives it. What the specific enemies of kidney health after 60 actually are, how they work inside the body's filtration system, and what concrete, practical, livable changes address them most meaningfully. I want to walk you through 4 of them with real clinical depth, because understanding the mechanism is what makes the protective choice feel like genuine self-care rather than arbitrary restriction. The first enemy is one that carries no flavor and involves no ingredient. You will find it nowhere on a food label. It is not something you eat or drink. It is the absence of something your kidneys depend on as fundamentally as they depend on water. Movement, the complete, sustained daily absence of adequate physical activity. What medicine calls a sedentary lifestyle, but what I prefer to describe to my patients in more human terms as the slow stilling of a system that was designed to flow. I want to explain the mechanism here specifically because most people think about physical activity in terms of weight and cardiovascular fitness, and perhaps bone density. Very few people think about it in terms of kidney perfusion, but the connection is direct and important. Your kidneys receive approximately 20% of every heartbeat's output. 1/5 of everything your heart pumps flows toward those 2 organs to be filtered. That delivery depends on a circulatory system that is moving efficiently with adequate cardiac output and well-maintained blood vessel tone. When you move, when you walk, when your muscles contract rhythmically and your heart responds with increased output, the blood flowing to your kidneys arrives with force and volume. Filtration happens efficiently. Waste is cleared. The river runs strongly. When you spend most of your waking hours seated or reclining, the circulatory dynamics change. Cardiac output remains at its resting baseline. Blood pools in the lower extremities. The blood reaching the kidneys arrives at lower pressure and lower volume. And in this environment of reduced renal perfusion, a cascade of metabolic consequences begins to accumulate. Blood sugar regulation worsens because the muscles, which in movement absorb glucose actively from the bloodstream, are at rest and not contributing. Insulin resistance develops gradually. Blood pressure tends to rise because the cardiovascular system is not receiving the regulatory signals that regular movement provides. Body weight increases over time because caloric expenditure falls while appetite often does not. And each of these downstream consequences, elevated blood sugar, elevated blood pressure, increased body weight, is itself a direct threat to kidney filtration tissue. Here is what I want you to understand about this particular enemy. The solution does not require what you might fear it requires. I am not describing a need for gym memberships or structured exercise regimens or physical performance that feels out of reach. I am describing something far simpler and far more accessible. The human body was not designed for either stillness or athletic extremity. It was designed for consistent, moderate movement across the day, the kind of movement that keeps the circulatory river flowing rather than the kind that exhausts it. A 30-minute walk, a 10-minute walk 3 times across the day, standing up and moving for 5 minutes every hour during long periods of sitting, ankle rotations and gentle leg movements if mobility is restricted. These are not symbolic gestures. They are physiologically meaningful acts that change the blood flow reaching your kidneys, the blood sugar your muscles are processing, and the pressure your blood vessels are managing. Every time you choose them over stillness, you are choosing to keep the river moving. And a moving river does not silt. The second enemy is one that sits in medicine cabinets in virtually every home, that is sold without prescription in every pharmacy, and that carries the particular danger of familiarity. When something has been in your life for years without producing an obvious crisis, it is profoundly difficult to see it as a threat. And this particular enemy has benefited from that familiarity for decades. I am talking about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, the class that includes ibuprofen, naproxen, and diclofenac, among others. The pills that most people reach for when a knee aches, when a back tightens, when a headache settles in behind the eyes. These medications are genuinely effective for what they are designed to do. I want to be clear about that, because I am not dismissing pain management or suggesting that living with pain is preferable to addressing it. Inflammatory pain is real, and the relief these medications provide is real. The issue is not the mechanism. The issue is a specific unintended consequence of that mechanism that is almost never explained at the point of purchase, and that becomes significantly more dangerous in an older body with already reduced kidney reserve. Here is the biology. Inside the kidneys, the blood vessels that supply the filtration units are kept appropriately dilated, open, and flowing by a group of chemical signals called prostaglandins. These prostaglandins are produced locally within the kidney tissue and function as a continuous self-regulating system for maintaining adequate renal blood flow. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications work by blocking the enzyme responsible for producing prostaglandins throughout the body, because prostaglandins are also involved in the inflammatory cascade that produces pain. The pain relief is real. But the kidney's prostaglandins are blocked along with the inflammatory ones because the body does not operate a selective system that distinguishes between them. When renal prostaglandins are suppressed, the blood vessels supplying the kidney's filtration units constrict. The blood flow to the nephrons decreases, filtration slows, and in a kidney that is already managing with reduced reserve due to age, or that is already under additional stress from mild dehydration or elevated blood pressure, that reduction in blood flow can push the filtration system below the threshold at which it functions safely. Acute kidney injury can result from a single episode in a vulnerable patient, and chronic, cumulative damage results from the repeated pattern of constriction and partial recovery that occurs when these medications are taken regularly over weeks and months and years. What I see in my practice, and it is one of the most consistent and heartbreaking patterns I encounter, is older adults who have been taking an anti-inflammatory every day for years for chronic joint pain, arthritis, a back condition, without any physician specifically telling them that this daily habit is gradually and measurably reducing their kidney function. The pain is real. The medication helps the pain. Nobody connected the daily habit to the slow decline in the numbers on the blood panel. And by the time someone looked at both together and made the connection, the kidney function lost to that daily constriction cannot be recovered. I want to give you a concrete, practical alternative to this pattern, because the answer is not to tell someone with genuine chronic pain to simply endure it. The answer is to find a path that manages the pain without the renal cost. Paracetamol, taken at appropriate doses and not exceeded, carries significantly less risk to kidney filtration tissue than the NSAID class. It is not equally effective for every type of pain, and there are conditions for which it is inadequate. But for many people managing day-to-day joint ache or muscle discomfort, it is the kidney-safer choice, and the comparison is worth having explicitly with your physician. Physical therapy, heat and cold applications, anti-inflammatory dietary approaches, and in some cases topical preparations that deliver anti-inflammatory effect locally without significant systemic absorption, all represent options that reduce dependence on oral NSAIDs. And if oral NSAIDs are genuinely necessary, Intermittent use with adequate hydration and medical oversight is a fundamentally different risk profile from daily unsupervised use. Bring your complete medication list, including over-the-counter products, to your next appointment, and ask specifically whether any of them fall into the NSAID category and whether alternatives exist for your situation. The third enemy is one I want to approach with some care, because it is simultaneously the most practically manageable and the most underestimated. It hides not in the salt shaker on your table, which most of my patients have long since put away, but in the processed and packaged food products that constitute the modern food environment. Hidden sodium. The sodium that arrives in your body not through a deliberate seasoning decision, but through the manufacturing of foods designed to be shelf-stable, palatable, and commercially appealing. Bread, processed meats, canned products, ready-made sauces, cheese, breakfast cereals, crackers, soups, seasoning mixes. The list of products containing significant sodium, without tasting obviously salty, is longer than most people realize, and it is in those products that the vast majority of the sodium in most modern diets originates. Why does sodium matter so specifically for kidney health? The mechanism runs through blood pressure, which is the second leading cause of kidney disease after diabetes, and it operates with a directness and consistency that makes it one of the most important modifiable risk factors in the entire kidney health picture. When sodium intake chronically exceeds what the body requires, the osmotic balance in the bloodstream shifts. To compensate, the body retains water, expanding blood volume. Greater blood volume means greater pressure against the walls of every artery and every vessel in the body. And within the kidney, those vessels include the delicate microvasculature threading through the filtration units, the glomeruli, where the actual filtering work happens. The glomeruli are among the most structurally delicate vascular structures in the entire body. They are intricate, fragile webs of microscopic capillaries through which blood is pushed under pressure to accomplish filtration. They are designed to handle normal physiological blood pressure within a range that preserves their architecture over a lifetime. Chronically elevated blood pressure, driven by sustained excess sodium intake over years and decades, subjects those delicate structures to mechanical force they were not designed to absorb repeatedly. The capillary walls thicken, scar tissue forms, filtration capacity in that unit diminishes permanently, and the process repeats, unit by unit, across both kidneys, so gradually and so silently that the cumulative loss of function does not announce itself until it has already become clinically significant. The practical response to this enemy requires what I call a label literacy shift rather than a dietary overhaul. I am not asking you to cook every meal from scratch or to transform your relationship with food overnight. I am asking you to begin reading the sodium content on the products you already buy, because that information is there, and because seeing the actual numbers changes the choices people make in a way that general advice about eating less salt rarely does. Turn the package over. Find the sodium content per serving. In many processed products, a single serving contains 300, 500, sometimes 800 milligrams of sodium. The daily recommended limit is around 2,000 to 2,300 milligrams total for most adults. For anyone with established hypertension or kidney disease, the target is closer to 1,500. A single portion of a processed soup, a slice of deli meat, a serving of a common commercial sauce can consume a significant fraction of that entire daily budget in a way that the product's taste does not warn you about. The replacement strategy is not about deprivation. It is about rediscovering what food tastes like when it is flavored with something other than sodium. Garlic, fresh herbs, black pepper, lemon, vinegar, smoked paprika, turmeric. These are not consolation prizes for giving up flavor. They are, in the experience of virtually every patient who makes the transition consistently over several weeks, a genuine revelation about how much more complex and interesting food can taste when the palate is no longer calibrated to sodium. The transition takes time. The first few weeks may feel like something is missing. By the 6th week, the foods that once seemed normal begin to taste aggressively salty in a way that was always true but previously unperceived. That recalibration is real, it is biological, and it happens predictably to virtually everyone who makes this change consistently. Now we arrive at the fourth enemy. The one I consider the most pervasive, the most underestimated, and in terms of its effects on kidney health specifically after 60, the most consequential of all. And I want to approach it with the same respect I bring to anything that is genuinely complex and deeply woven into daily life. I am talking about sugar, specifically the excessive chronic consumption of rapidly absorbed sugars and refined carbohydrates that characterizes the modern diet in ways that were entirely different 50 years ago, and that the human metabolic system, evolved over millennia, was never designed to manage at this scale. Sugar is not a simple enemy. It is embedded in pleasure, in comfort, in celebration, in the sensory rewards that are part of what makes daily life feel worthwhile. I am not asking you to abandon sweetness. I am asking you to understand what happens inside your body, specifically inside your metabolic and kidney physiology, when refined sugar and its metabolic equivalent, white flour and other rapidly digested refined carbohydrates, are consumed in the quantities that are now ordinary in the modern diet. Because that understanding, clearly held, changes the choices that feel possible and meaningful in a way that general dietary advice alone rarely achieves. The pathway from sugar to kidney damage runs through several parallel routes, and each one deserves to be named clearly. The most direct route is through type 2 diabetes, which is the single leading cause of kidney failure worldwide. Diabetes does not develop overnight. It develops through a progression that begins with insulin resistance, the gradual diminishing of the body's cells' response to the insulin signal, and advances through prediabetes to established diabetes over years, often more than a decade, during which blood sugar levels are elevated above the ideal range even if they have not yet crossed the diagnostic threshold for diabetes. And throughout that entire progression, even in the pre-diabetic stage, the elevated blood glucose is doing measurable damage to the kidney's filtration membranes. Here is the specific mechanism that I find changes how my patients think about this. The filtration barrier inside each glomerulus is a structure of extraordinary delicacy and precision. It allows water, small molecules, and waste products to pass through while retaining proteins and blood cells. It is one of the most selective biological membranes in the body. When blood glucose is chronically elevated, that glucose interacts with the proteins making up the filtration membrane through a process of glycation, essentially a biological caramelization. The membrane proteins become stiffer, their selective permeability changes, and the structural integrity of the filtration unit is progressively compromised. Protein begins to appear in the urine because the damaged membrane can no longer retain it. That protein leakage, called proteinuria, is one of the earliest detectable signs of diabetic kidney damage, and it precedes obvious symptoms by years. Many people are already leaking protein into their urine, already experiencing this early kidney damage, without any symptom to alert them because no one has measured it. The second route from sugar to kidney damage runs through blood pressure, and it is less well known than the connection to diabetes but equally important. Chronic high sugar intake elevates blood pressure through mechanisms that are distinct from sodium's effects and that operate independently of how much salt a person consumes. Fructose, the component of table sugar that is processed almost exclusively by the liver, triggers a cascade of metabolic signals that include elevated uric acid levels, impaired nitric oxide production, and activation of hormonal systems that raise blood pressure. A person can be eating very little sodium and still be experiencing sugar-driven hypertension, and the two effects are additive in someone consuming both excess sodium and excess sugar simultaneously. The hypertension damages the kidney's microvasculature through the same mechanical stress mechanism I described earlier. The two routes converge on the same destination: progressive, silent loss of filtration capacity. The third route is through inflammation. The chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that accompanies sustained high sugar consumption is now one of the most extensively studied mechanisms in modern medicine's understanding of chronic disease. The pathways through which refined carbohydrates activate inflammatory signaling are complex at the molecular level, but the practical effect is something that can be understood simply. Your body's immune system operates through chemical signals, and some of those signals have inflammatory effects that, when chronically activated, damage the tissues they were originally designed to protect. The kidney, as one of the most metabolically active and continuously working organs, is among the tissues most exposed to this inflammatory burden. Chronic inflammation scars kidney tissue, reduces functional nephron capacity, and accelerates the age-related decline in filtration efficiency in ways that stack on top of the vascular and glycation damage already occurring. The fourth route is through body weight and its metabolic consequences. Excess refined carbohydrate and sugar that is not burned as immediate energy is converted to and stored as fat. In older adults, where basal metabolic rate has declined and physical activity may have decreased, this conversion and storage happens more readily than it did at 40. Excess body weight creates a state of metabolic stress that elevates blood sugar, raises blood pressure, promotes inflammation, and places increased filtration demand on the kidneys as they manage the metabolic output of a larger body mass. These are not independent effects. They reinforce and compound each other, creating a pattern of kidney stress that is more than the sum of its individual parts. I want to spend time on the practical because this is where I know the conversation becomes most difficult. Sugar and refined carbohydrates are not simply dietary choices in the conventional sense. They are substances with documented effects on the brain's reward circuitry. The dopamine response to sweet taste is real and physiological. The craving cycle that develops around high sugar consumption is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It is a biological adaptation that the food environment has in many ways deliberately exploited. Understanding this does not excuse the choice, but it does mean that making a different choice requires more than information. It requires strategy. The single most powerful substitution I recommend to my patients is also the simplest and the most consistent in its effectiveness. Replace sweetened beverages with water, plain sparkling water, or unsweetened herbal infusions. A single sweetened drink, whether a commercial soft drink, a commercial fruit juice, a sweetened tea or coffee beverage, or an energy drink, can deliver more rapidly absorbed sugar than the body was designed to process in an entire day. These liquid sugars arrive in the bloodstream more rapidly than any solid food, produce a more intense insulin response, and provide no satiety, no fiber, and no compensating nutritional benefit. Eliminating them or reducing them substantially is the change with the highest return-to-effort ratio in the entire dietary modification landscape for kidney health. It is not easy for everyone, but it is the most impactful single step available to most people, and it does not require cooking skill, special ingredients, or significant expense. Beyond beverages, the strategy I find most successful with my patients is not restriction thinking, but substitution thinking. Not what must I give up, but what can I replace it with that satisfies the underlying need. The need for something sweet in the mid-afternoon is a real physiological signal. Satisfying it with a piece of whole fruit provides natural sugars alongside fiber, water, and micronutrients that slow absorption and prevent the blood glucose spike that refined sugar produces. Satisfying it with a handful of nuts provides protein and fat that produce satiety and do not stimulate insulin release. These are not perfect substitutes in the sense of producing identical immediate pleasure, but they are substitutes that the body, over weeks of consistent practice, genuinely adapts to and eventually prefers, as the blood glucose cycling that creates the craving begins to stabilize. White flour and the products made from it, bread, pasta, pastry, crackers, deserve explicit attention because they are perhaps the most invisible high glycemic food in most people's diet. They do not taste sweet. They do not register psychologically as sugar. But their glycemic impact, the speed and magnitude of blood glucose rise they produce, is comparable to, or in some cases exceeds that of obvious sugars, because the starch in refined flour is digested and absorbed with a rapidity that the body's insulin response struggles to match. Replacing white flour products with whole grain alternatives does not eliminate the glucose load, but it fundamentally changes its timing and magnitude. The fiber in whole grain products slows digestion, smooths the blood glucose curve, reduces the insulin demand, and supports the gut microbiome in ways that have downstream anti-inflammatory effects. The transition from refined to whole grain products is one that most people, if they commit to it for 3 to 4 weeks, find they maintain naturally because their body's relationship with hunger and satiety genuinely improves. I want to come back now to something I said at the beginning, because I think it is important to return to it with everything we have covered between us. I said that the conversation I wanted to have with you was not a frightening one, but an honest one. And I want to make sure that is what this has been. Because the four enemies I have described, physical inactivity, habitual NSAID use, excess hidden sodium, and chronic sugar and refined carbohydrate consumption, are not abstract risks. They are specific, documented, biological mechanisms through which kidney function is compromised in millions of older adults, often without a single symptom to signal the process, often across years during which protective change was entirely possible. But they are also, every single one of them, modifiable. That is the word I want to leave you with: modifiable. The sedentary hour can become a walking hour. The daily anti-inflammatory can become a conversation with your physician about alternatives. The sodium in the packaged food can become the herb in the home-cooked meal. The sweetened drink can become the glass of water with lemon. None of these changes requires a dramatic reinvention of your life. None of them asks you to abandon pleasure or comfort or the rhythms of daily living that give your days their texture and their meaning. They ask for attention, for the willingness to look closely at ordinary choices and understand what they are doing inside a body that has been working faithfully for 6 or 7 decades and deserves, with the same faithfulness, to be looked after in return. I want to tell you about a patient I will call Colette, 72 years old, retired librarian, a woman who had read everything throughout her life, who was thoughtful and careful and deeply engaged with the world. She came to me after a blood panel flagged declining kidney function, and we sat down together for a long initial conversation that covered her entire daily routine in real detail. What emerged from that conversation was not dramatic. It was ordinary. She did not exercise because her knees were painful, and the medication she took for her knees was ibuprofen, taken daily for 3 years. She ate very carefully in her own estimation, but her diet was built largely around convenient packaged foods because cooking for one felt like more effort than the meal warranted. She drank 2 cups of sweetened tea in the afternoon as her pleasure, her reward for the day's tasks, and a small glass of juice with her breakfast because she believed it was healthy. She had never once looked at the sodium content on a food label. She had never been told to. Each of these pieces, in isolation, might seem manageable. Together, in a 72-year-old body with the reduced renal reserve that age brings, they had combined into a pattern of kidney stress that showed up as measurably declining filtration on her blood panel. We made changes together gradually over several months. We addressed the knee pain through a combination of paracetamol, which is gentler on the kidneys, a course of physiotherapy that she found genuinely helpful, and the addition of a short, flat daily walk that did not aggravate her joint but maintained the circulatory flow her kidneys depended on. We moved her packaged meals toward simpler, home-prepared alternatives, not elaborate ones, simple ones. We replaced the sweetened tea with an herbal infusion she discovered she enjoyed. We eliminated the breakfast juice entirely and replaced it with water and a piece of whole fruit. 6 months later, her kidney function had stabilized. Not reversed dramatically, stabilized. And for a 62-year-old kidney under that degree of cumulative stress, stabilization is the goal. It is the change in trajectory that determines whether the next 5 years look like continued gradual decline or like a plateau, a maintained level of function that allows a full and active life. She told me at that 6-month appointment something that I think about when I consider why these conversations matter. She said she had spent 3 years telling herself that the choices she was making were small and that small choices could not be the thing that was hurting her kidneys. She had expected the cause of her kidney decline to be something larger, something more dramatic, something with a name and a prescription attached. She had not expected it to be the ibuprofen for her knees and the juice at breakfast and the years without a walk. She had not expected the accumulation of ordinary things to add up to something clinical. That expectation, the belief that the ordinary cannot be the mechanism of the serious, is one of the most significant obstacles between older adults and the kidney protection that is genuinely within their reach. The kidneys do not distinguish between dramatic insults and accumulated ordinary ones. They respond to what they receive, day after day, in the language of function and function lost. And what they need from us is not perfection, it is consistency. consistent movement, consistent moderation of the things that constrict them, inflame them, and overload them with what they were not designed to process. Consistent supply of what they need to do their work well, adequate fluid, adequate blood flow, a metabolic environment that does not demand beyond their aging capacity. Before I leave you with the practical summary, I want to say one more thing about signals. Because the kidneys are silent does not mean they are entirely without communication. It means the communication is subtle, and that subtlety requires attention. Persistent fatigue that is qualitatively different from tiredness, a heaviness that rest does not resolve, can reflect the anemia that results when the kidneys can no longer adequately signal red blood cell production. Swelling in the ankles or feet that is new, or puffiness around the eyes upon waking, can reflect the kidney's declining ability to regulate fluid excretion. Urine that is persistently foamy or frothy is not a trivial observation. It reflects protein in the urine, protein that should be retained in the blood, and is instead passing through a filtration barrier that has been damaged, and it warrants a conversation with your physician and a urine test. Increased frequency of urination at night, beyond what you have experienced as your normal pattern, can reflect the kidney's reduced ability to concentrate urine efficiently and their need to process fluid across more cycles. And blood pressure that is persistently difficult to control despite medication may, in some cases, reflect the kidney's own contribution to blood pressure regulation being compromised. None of these signals is a diagnosis. But each of them, when new or progressive, is a reason to request a kidney function assessment that includes both the estimated glomerular filtration rate and a measurement of urine protein. These two values together provide a far more complete picture of kidney health than either alone, and together they can identify early-stage compromise when the window for protective change is widest. If you are over 60 and have not had both of these measured recently, that request is worth making at your next routine appointment regardless of how well you feel. Let me bring everything together now in the clearest terms I can offer. The 4 enemies of kidney health after 60 are physical inactivity, habitual NSAID use, chronic excess sodium, and the combined metabolic assault of sugar and refined carbohydrates. Each operates through a distinct mechanism. Inactivity reduces the circulatory flow that the kidneys depend on for efficient filtration and creates the metabolic conditions that accelerate the diseases that damage them most. NSAIDs constrict the blood vessels supplying the filtration units and reduce perfusion in an organ system that cannot afford reduced perfusion. Excess sodium drives blood pressure into the range that physically scars the filtration microvasculature over time. And sugar, through diabetes, blood pressure, inflammation, and body weight, launches a simultaneous, multi-directional attack on the kidney's architecture that is among the most consequential ongoing threats in the modern health landscape. Each of these 4 enemies is modifiable. The movement can begin tomorrow morning. The NSAID conversation can happen at the next appointment. The label reading can start the next time you open a cabinet door. The sweetened beverage can become, beginning today, something different in your glass. These are not heroic acts. They are small, consistent, cumulative acts of attention toward a part of your body that has been giving you everything it has, without complaint, without rest, for every day of your life. Give it the same quiet consistency in return. Not perfection. Consistency. That is all the kidneys ask of you, and it is entirely within your reach.